Thousands of people drive past this memorial in Wilmington every day, but many may not know its origins. The monument stands to remind us of Wilmington's darkest chapter, the Massacre of 1898. WECT's Francis Weller explains how the tragic event still impacts Wilmington to this day and how we can learn from it to better our communities down the road.
With Charlotte and Raleigh both sprawling today, it's hard to imagine Wilmington was once the largest city in North Carolina and the most successful. Following the Civil War, poor white laborers and African Americans formed a political bond, both seeking to create a better future following the collapse of Dixie. Wilmington grew into a haven for African Americans who not only helped rebuild a struggling port city, but became prominent newspaper editors, business owners, and politicians. More than half of the city was African American, and their rise to power brewed resentment among white elites still reeling in the Reconstruction South. As the years went on and African Americans became more entrenched in power and prestige, white leaders feared what was happening in Wilmington would spawn to other cities throughout North Carolina. In their eyes, something had to be done, and a growing wave of anti-African American propaganda, intimidation, and violence carried into Election Day, November 8, 1898. Fearing harm to person and property, many African Americans shied away from the ballot box, and coupled with widespread election fraud, led to sweeping victories for the Democratic Party, a party unlike the one we now know today. However, white supremacists still had not gained full control over Wilmington's politics, and on November 10th, they would take to the streets to burn down black-owned businesses, remove black politicians from power, and murder countless others. The massacre and coup d'etat of 1898 was forever cemented in history, and what white leaders had hoped would change Wilmington for the better had the opposite effect. Nearly overnight, the city's strong African American population had either been stripped of power, run out of town, or killed in cold blood. The events of that day would take Wilmington from the top of North Carolina's commerce to a city that would languish in irrelevancy for the next century. But the real impact haunts the families of those who were forever changed on November 10th, 1898. African Americans forced to run for their lives and leave behind years of hard work if they were able to escape with their life. Now, 125 years later, it's our responsibility, our duty, to learn from this unspeakable tragedy and speak the truth so that the events of 1898 are resigned to history and never repeated again.
The events of 1898 have recently been thrust into the national spotlight, with documentaries and Pulitzer Prize-winning books bringing to light what happened in Wilmington.